Hi, this is Shane Morton with IndieExpress.com, and I'm here with Mark Hartley, the director of Not Quite Hollywood, playing here at the AFI Film Festival in Los Angeles. Hi, tell us a little bit about how you came up with the idea of making this film about the Ozploitation.
Well, I guess if people would need to know, Ozploitation is Australian genre cinema, and it seemed to me that it was the only it was the last bastion of genre cinema that had never been explored anywhere in the world. We'd had kind of really fevered examinations of American grindhouse and of Hammer horror and Canadian horror and things like that, but no one had ever looked at the Australian, or no one even knew that there was this large number of Australian genre films that had been made in the 70s and 80s.
What kind of can you talk about kind of the what that is?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. In Australia, we in the 70s, Australian audiences embraced our art house films as our commercial films. So films like Picnic at Hanging Rock and The Getting of Wisdom, all those films that people associate with Australia, were the ones that were considered our big mainstream commercial films. So anything that wasn't one of those historic, elegiac period films was considered B grade. So that's why Ozploitation covers a really large number of genres, because it's everything that wasn't those period films. So it covers, our action, our horror films, and the industry in Australia really started off by making these cheap and cheerful kind of nudie romps. So it covers all those as well.
So what kind of made you decide that this was something that needed to be seen and explored?
When I was a kid, I saw some of these films on TV, and I went to read about them, and there was nothing written in any of the history books on Australian film. So I discovered there was this large number of films and a lot of filmmakers who had never been even, they'd been written out of the history books. So it was all about kind of setting the record straight in a way and shining a spotlight on some of these people who I always thought were just as skilled in the craft of making films as our more lauded filmmakers, but because they chose to work in genre, had never really got any respect.
And these are the films that kind of would play like the midnight on your TV channels, like the late.
Well, everything seemed late when I was a kid, so I'm sure that they weren't that late. But now these films, what's interesting, one of the most interesting things I found when I made the doco is that in Australia we didn't think that these films found any audiences at all, because they didn't in Australia. But when I was obviously interviewing the international people, these films found wild, enthusiastic audiences all around the world and were more successful in other territories than in Australia. And in Australia, as I said, the backlash was, why are we making these films that are American films? We should be making Australian films. But overseas, they saw something very Australian about these that we couldn't see in Australia. They saw there was a sensibility to them that was very different to any other genre film coming out from the rest of the world.
And you were able to get the clips and everything from the films pretty easily, I suppose, because some of them you work with the distribution company for some of them, right?
I spent, when I was doing the research for Not Quite Hollywood, I spent a large amount of time getting these films on DVD, putting the DVDs out of them. So it wasn't that I had built relationships with the producers and the rights holders, so that made it easier. We still had to pay for all of them. No one gave us anything for free. And it still was a large undertaking. We chronicle about 100 films, I think, in it. The doco features clips from 100 films, so it was a large amount of material to find. And we went, in every case except for one, off the original negs of the film. So finding that was really, it was a big job.
So it was a big post.
Yeah, and the post was done us about as well, because we had so much material we had to get through from the archive, from the film archive, to transfer, that we weren't exactly sure. We hadn't cut the film at that point. We were still cutting it. We didn't know exactly what we'd be using, so it was a matter of just transferring as much as we could and hoping that we didn't have to go back to get seconds on any of the stuff.
How long did it take you to put the film together?
Overall, it took 10 years to get the film up and made. But the post was about 8 months. We ended up with 350 hours of material in the end, and just watching that, I think, took a month in real time. So it was a big undertaking, culling that down to 100 minutes. And it was, I guess it's different when you're making it. If you're making a film documentary on American cinema, it's easy because people are very aware of the films that you're talking about. We were making a documentary about films that no one had heard of, or very few people had heard of. So it was all about how much information do we give people about these films before we cut to the incredibly crazy anecdotes about the making of these films. Because it is a documentary about renegade maverick filmmakers pushing the boundaries of what could be done safely and not so safely on set to get their vision on screen. So it's a lot of wild stories.
For example, tell us one of your favorites.
A director called Brian Trenchard Smith was making a film called The Man from Hong Kong, where he had George Lazenby, Australia's James Bond, in the lead. And Brian wanted George to set himself on fire in the film. So Brian, the director, actually set himself on fire in front of the crew first to prove that George that it could be done quite easily and quite safely. And so George said, after the director set himself on fire, how could I say no? So he set himself on fire for the film and discovers what happens when you set yourself on fire. You burn. So there you go. There's one of the stories from Not Quite. There's another great one. Dennis Hopper tells a story. We got to interview Dennis. We interviewed quite a few people who had actually appeared in these films, come from America to appear in these films, like Dennis, Stacey Keach, Jamie Lee Curtis. Dennis was in Australia in 1976, a time that he can't remember very well for obvious reasons. And he was absolutely paralytic drunk. He'd been drunk probably for the last 12 years maybe. And the police pulled him over and they did a breathalyzer test. And with the amount of alcohol and whatever other substances he had in his body, they pronounced him clinically and legally dead. He was taken before the judge and he was told that he was never allowed again to drive a car in the state of Victoria in Australia, and also never allowed to be a passenger in a car in Victoria. So there you go. There's a couple of the stories.
Now that's wild. I love that.
And then he was escorted to the airport. So that's one way to leave Australia, I guess.
When you approached a lot of these people about being a part of the film, and did you find that they were very quickly, very easily moved to be a part of it because of kind of what it was about and the time it was?
Yeah, it was interesting. Before we made the doco, particularly people in the funding body, said, who on earth is going to want to talk about these films? And we found that the exact opposite was the case. Everyone was very keen to. And I think part of the reason was because no one had ever spoken to them about these films before. And a lot of them were very fond and affectionate towards these movies. So yeah, we had a really amazing reaction. I think there was 3 people in all the people we contacted on my wish list who couldn't do it or who refused to do it. And that was more for other reasons, financial reasons, things like that. But yeah, we interviewed about 90 people for it and got an amazing list of people who all had great stories. So it's a particularly irreverent and honest documentary. No one minces words about these films. If they're awful, they'll tell you they're awful. If they hated someone on set, they'll tell you exactly why they hated them on set. So it's pretty honest. And as far as documentaries go, it's probably wildly undisciplined, I think. And that's, I think, part of the reason that people have found it so entertaining. It's not a soul-searching study of the African yak, that's for sure.
Now, it's been playing a lot of film festivals, Toronto, Austin, Warsaw, you were saying, and many, many, many more. What's next for the movie and what's next for you?
Well, Magnolia, HDNet's got the rights here, and I think they're doing a theatrical sometime in the first quarter of next year. So that'll be great. And next to me, there's a film featured in the documentary called Patrick, a film about a patient in a clinic in a coma who has telekinetic powers, and the producers asked me to work on developing a remake of that, so that'll be interesting.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot for sitting down here with us and talking about the film, Not Quite Hollywood. And do you have any last things you would like to say, maybe to like a young documentary filmmaker who wants to get their film started?
All I can do is encourage people to see my film.
It will help, right?
True, yeah. They will, and then they can email me and I can tell them all the horror stories about the making of it. But I think they need to see the film first.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. This has been Shane Morton with Mark Hartley, here for Not Quite Hollywood at the AFI Film Festival.